Would it shock you to know that over 1 million children under the age of 9 have had their identities stolen in the last year alone? It's important to be aware of how this can happen and what you need to do to prevent it from happening to your children. Today's guest is Kelli Grant. Kelli is currently senior editor at CNBC and was the senior consumer reporter at Marketwatch and Smart Money. Kelli has earned the Certified Financial Planner designation, which recognizes financial advisors who meet education, experience, and ethics requirements and have passed a tough industry exam. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Kipplinger's Personal Finance, Good Housekeeping, Real Simple, and Family Circle, among other publications. I'm your host, Chris Parker, and this is the Easy Pray Podcast. Kelli, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray Podcast today.
Really happy to be here, Chris.
Thank you. Can you tell myself and the audience a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got involved in what you're doing?
Well, right now I am a senior editor at CNBC. I work on Grow, which is part of their partnership with the fintech app Acorns. But my background is all personal finance. I've been a personal finance reporter for more than 15 years, and I'm actually one of the few working journalists to have earned the Certified Financial Planner designation. Usually that's awarded to financial advisors.
That's usually takes a lot of work and a lot of classes for that, right?
It does. Classes, studying, experience time, and a real beast of a credentialing exam.
And it helps you, I'm sure, be a better reporter and better understanding financial matters when you're talking about them with people.
I know a lot about money, and I know how to track it down.
So let's start talking about I don't want to say childhood identity theft, but identity theft of children's identities.
Well, they are stealing the kids' childhood. In a lot of cases, their adulthood, too. It's a really scary trend, and this is something that I have written about a number of times over the years in the course of my reporting. And as a parent, it's something that concerns me, too. And it's unfortunately all too common. There was some new data out from Javelin. They estimated it's more than 1.25 million kids in the U.S. fell victim to, they combine it's identity theft and fraud in the past year. And this is just some data that came out in November 2021. And, really when you drill into that, there are some really scary elements to it, that it's more than half of these cases are in kids that are ages 9 or younger. And about 70% of the victims actually know the perpetrator, meaning that's somebody who is in their life.
That's scary. So as a point of clarity, what is the difference between fraud and identity theft when it comes to children?
Well, really in a lot of cases, and I think the reason why they do combine it is there can be some blurring. Fraud in a lot of cases is, we think about it as adults as the person is compromising something existing. It's a charge on your existing credit card or some other sort of a mark like that. Identity theft is more they're taking your personal identifying information and using it to, create something new or perpetuate some sort of a new crime. Can be anything from they are, maybe say taking a social security number and opening up a new loan or line of credit in that person's name. They could use it to file tax returns. They can use it to create an employment record, to create all sorts of medical bill havoc and criminal mischief. It really can run the full range.
Wow, that's scary. So let's start from the beginning. How is the identity theft against children actually happening?
So there's a lot of different ways that this can happen. There's some separate data that came out of University of Texas. So in terms of how this happens, you'll see that in a lot of cases, it's actually on paper. Most people think about identity theft and data fraud as something that happens digitally. You've got that like nameless, faceless hacker. But in a lot of cases, this particular thing with kids ends up being paper. It's everything from easy access. You've got, papers on the table in the dining room and a friend or relative can see them, or worse, they just know where in your house you keep these things so they can go into the filing cabinet. They have regular access. It could be things like stolen mail, or in the case of maybe a business access, you've got records at, say, your doctor's office where you filled out a form when you signed up and you've got your kids' info on there, including maybe you gave them a social, and then that's something that is either not properly stored, not properly disposed of, someone is bribed to get access to it. Lots of unfortunate scenarios within there.
And I guess when I think of like doctor's office, kind of a tangential thought, I remember when I was in college, they used your social security number as your student ID. And it was printed on everything, and you had to put it on everything when you were going places. I was like, oh my gosh. I look back at it now and say, amazing that I wasn't a victim of identity theft. But
yeah. They've moved largely away from that, thankfully. But there for a long time there's still IDs where you would have your social either on it, or that would be closely tied to something else you had signed up for. But yeah, definitely something they try to avoid these days.
So is it that these places are mishandling the paper? Like, obviously, if someone's come into your house and rifling through your documents, that's one thing. But is it that you're having employees stealing stuff, or is it just mismanagement of documents at some of these places?
It can really range. I mean, it might be that employees are mishandling it. In some cases, the businesses necessarily don't know, the value of some of the information that they're collecting, or how to properly store it. It's been a big problem, for example, financial advisors, not particularly related to children here, but that they have been trying to figure out the right ways to store and maintain their records, which obviously includes a lot of personally identifying information. So it's a challenge for small businesses that have to figure out how do they avoid hackers? How do they avoid bad actors that might have access to their offices? And, these are folks who are professionals in other areas. They're not necessarily tech professionals or cybersecurity experts, but they have to figure that out and kind of put on that hat to keep us safe.
Yeah. So when it comes to doctors' offices, do we need to be providing social security numbers? Because that's kind of one of the things is like, okay, you're performing you're performing medical procedures or checking a kid's health or whatever. You should have a insurance identifier number. Why do they need a social security number?
Well, exactly. And that's like one of the things that this is sort of a holdover from is it is another way to identify you and track you and, maybe get you to pay your bill if you hadn't already. But, my cell phone does that just as well. And I'm much more happy to provide that. So my first big tip for consumers is really to think about where you might be giving out this access and try to keep that information out of circulation. Usually when you go to a doctor's office, or schools will sometimes ask for it, camps, after school activities, it might just be a space on the form. Maybe they don't even know why they think they need it. I always just leave it blank and I wait to see if they will ask me to provide it. I have at least and this is anecdotal, of course, but I have never been asked for it. They're usually just happy to accept the form with my name, address, whatever other information, and without that key detail.
That's interesting that they have it on the form, you leave it blank, and no one's ever questioned why it's blank.
Yeah. And that's always, my husband and I have this conversation because occasionally he'll be like, oh, do we have this bit of information or that bit of information for the kids? I'm like, yeah, you don't need to give them that. I feel the same way about giving my driver's license when they ask for some of that too. It's like, you can find me in other ways, but you do not need my driver's license number.
And I guess it's just a little bit of that is just a throwback to at some point in the past, somebody thought it would be a useful piece of information to have for some reason. And it's just always been on the form since then.
Exactly.
I mean, I guess it's the same sort of thing of if I'm creating an account on an online store and they ask for my birth date, what do you need my birth? Do you really need my birth date? Like, I'm sure you want to send me a coupon or something like that to get me to spend more money with you, but it's just one more place where information can be exposed.
Exactly. And I think a lot of that is like we fill it out by rote. We really want that coupon. We don't see the harm in it. But the problem is for a lot of identity theft and just data breaches in general, these thieves take bits of information and then they use it to crack other things, because maybe, finding out your birth date, you feel like it's innocuous, but that ends up being a security question or something that they can use when they call and say, to your bank, oh, I'm locked out of my account. The rep might say, okay, ma'am, please tell me, your full name, your address, and your birth date, So you have to be thinking about, as a consumer, unfortunately, all the different pieces of information and ways that might be used. You'll even see it on social where and this is another thing to watch out for with kids is that, those popular, either like memes or quiz questions, things you'll see where it'll be like, tell us, your first initial, your pet's name, the street you grew up on, or it's like some combination of things that seems kind of funny and innocuous, and it'll, pop out then like, something that tells you supposedly about yourself. But really, when you look at this, you're going like, all right, I see this answer, and this answer. I'm like, those are security questions right there. No question.
Yeah. I always chuckle and cringe, I suppose, at the same time, whenever I see people answering those on social media. I'm like, those are all security questions. You really shouldn't be exposing that. Your high school mascot, where you went to elementary school.
And this is why you and I don't get invited to parties. We're the downers of the group.
I have a friend who he intentionally does not use his real birth date on anything. And so he has his Facebook birth date that rolls up every year, and everyone starts wishing him happy birthday. And he just kind of chuckles to himself because he knows who does and doesn't know him based on by when they wish him a happy birthday. Because he's like, I'm not giving Facebook my real birthday. I don't need to expose that information. And ever since, it's the running joke.
I love that.
So let's get back to children. So we talked about kind of social security numbers on doctors' forms. Kind of what other places are kind of maybe inadvertently collecting, or that we're inadvertently giving up our children's information.
Well, I think actually one of the things we should talk about too is why kids make such great targets, or attractive targets for these sorts of criminals. And it really is, it's twofold. One is that your kid is, compared to like when they're stealing adult information, it's a clean slate. They are really not worried about, does this child have bad credit, or like, will I be able to take out a loan? They really can do a lot more damage potentially with that. And because, you or I, like, we might spot a fraudulent charge on a credit card pretty quickly. We might be checking our credit report. Child identity theft can go unnoticed for years. There is an identity theft researcher. Her name is Axton Betts Hamilton. Her story is really compelling. She's now into adulthood, but when she was 19, she went off to get her first apartment in college. And that's when she discovered she had this, she had been a victim of identity theft, and she had years and years of debts on her credit report when she pulled it. And, this was, undiscovered for years because she had not thought to check her credit report. She didn't have a credit card. She didn't have any of this stuff that she knew of. And then the twist there is that the person who stole her identity was her mother.
Oh.
So, but a really, really fascinating story. She's actually written a book about it now. I would definitely suggest checking that out.
What do you want the name of the book is?
I do not offhand. I did not bring that in my notes. Sorry.
That's okay. We'll find it and then put it in the show notes. I mean, that to me, it's interesting that the children's identity is this clean slate. Is it also then kind of used to build fake information into, because there's no existing information there?
Yes. So there's this thing called synthetic identity theft. I'm sure you've talked and read about that, but for the listeners, the basic idea is that the identity thieves will compile some stuff that's real, some stuff that's manufactured, some stuff from different sources. But if they have kind of that clean slate with a social security number, they can cobble that together and help really build a new identity for someone. So it really doesn't look like you've got a 5-year-old that's applying for a mortgage. They can piece that together so that it just becomes a really attractive target.
That's crazy. Do they kind of have an idea of how much money is involved in this kind of industry of creating fake identities based off of children's?
Well, I mean, in terms of the numbers, so this new Javelin data, that when they were looking at that, their estimate was 918 million lost to child ID fraud just in the past year. And the average affected family loses about $1,100. And of course, that figure's got, there's some flex in there, I would say, because certainly for some cases, like, people are able to fight this, they're able to wipe out those balances, but, they do spend a lot of time and resources fighting it. And when it comes to certain types of fraud, like they call it familiar fraud, when the perpetrator is someone you know, It can be really hard to fight that because to a certain extent, the lenders and even like the courts and police authorities they have a hard time disentangling. Like if a husband steals, say, a wife's identity, like that it's like, well, how'd you not know that your husband was opening these cards in your name? How do we know that like you really had nothing to do with this? So there's a little bit of that element in there that makes it tougher to fight.
And I suppose to some extent, even if it's a child whose parent has stolen their identity, you now have to do things that will potentially put your parent in jail. And as much as you're frustrated by the experience or upset with the experience, there's always going to be a certain amount of pool of like, well, I don't want to be the one who puts my mom in jail, even though it really wasn't you, it was their behavior.
Yeah, and that just really makes it complicated with this, because in the end, even if people have suspicions, and maybe it is a parent that's stolen the identity, or the parent knows that it was another relative who had access to the house, like it does complicate your willingness and ability to fight this.
Yeah. So let's kind of work backwards into this. If your child's identity has been compromised, what can you do to kind of help restore it back to your kid, to remove all the fake records and whatnot?
It's going to be tough to fight it. I mean, I think probably the first thing to say within this is, think about what the signs might be that your child's identity has been compromised, because, sometimes the early stuff is going to be, like things like pre-approved credit card offers showing up in your child's name, something that you would sort of deem more like adult mail for a child. Like people will sort of laugh and be like, oh, my kid got a jury summons, or like, this happened or that, but, like that should be a red flag. Missing mail just generally is a big issue. In other cases where you might hear about it, I'm thinking like data breach notifications, sites that involve some of your child's information, or if you get something like indications of tax fraud, because when you file your taxes, you've got your social listed on it, you've got your children's social listed on that as well. That's when you would want to take steps, including pulling credit reports to see if your child has a credit file. They don't necessarily have one. That's sort of a twist with kids, where you and I could easily pull our credit when you're young. There shouldn't be anything to pull. That would be your indication that nothing has happened. But if there's something for you to pull, then you certainly want to pull that credit report, get a sense of what is there. You can now put a freeze on your child's credit report. There's some back and forth there as to whether that's a good idea. So credit freeze essentially means, it's frozen. It's locked tight. Nobody can use that social to apply for new credit or, really amend their credit. That includes the person, like legitimately, if I wanted to go and apply for something for myself and my credit is frozen, I have to lift it. There are a couple of schools of thoughts on whether it's a good or a bad thing, because if your kid doesn't have a credit file, like you can freeze your credit proactively and you can freeze your child's, and it can be a really smart move, but you'd have to create a credit file for them to freeze it. And then to later go in and look, unfreeze it so they can apply for financial aid, they can apply for loans, that sort of thing. You have to have a PIN. So you have to have good password and information management yourself, because you don't want to lose that PIN when you've like frozen it for your 6-year-old and then you need to remember it in 12 years. So you need to make sure that you have good management for that, and then that it's also somewhere else that, like, God forbid something happens to you, that somebody else can help your kid down the line.
And it's almost the sort of thing that if you're going to do that for your child, you really have to think, okay, if I move, then I need to unfreeze it, push the child's new address in there, and then refreeze it.
Well, it's less about like when you move, you wouldn't necessarily need to. It's more about then like when they needed it, when they actually needed a credit file for something down the line. That would be, something where somebody would be checking their credit legitimately. You'd want to make sure that was accessible to them.
I guess there's more ways to create a new PIN other than send it to the original mailing address.
Yes, but it would be it is going to get complicated if you don't remember that initial PIN, or you don't save it in a safe place. All of the things that we know that we can do with passwords.
And assuming that that PIN is in the right format 10 years later.
Correct.
Because who knows what they're going to be doing with their platform and their system so many decades later.
And even then, the freezing is not foolproof, because that is really just for financial identity theft. If someone was going to use your social to try to gain employment or file a fraudulent tax return or do any number of other things, the freeze is not going to prevent them from doing that. That's just really a red flag if they wanted to take it and go out and open new loans or lines of credit in your kid's name.
So would it also make sense to, and I haven't thought this question out to its conclusion yet, but to create tax record accounts, not like in terms of filing, but associating a tax ID number, social security number with a login that you've already created so that you can go in and check on tax filings?
Well, it's always good to have redundancies so that you can make sure that you're monitoring things. I mean, even like credit monitoring services, you really want to hunt around and see if you have access to that for free for one reason or another, or, if you do need to pay for it, what that is involved. But like, if you're doing that for yourself, like it can't hurt to have them keep an eye out for, your children as well. Anything with, I think, like tax documents, anything that that might be a risk, you want to make sure that that's where you're really using like your smart password hygiene. You are, not reusing passwords or logins that you've put elsewhere. Same thing with bank accounts. Like you really want to make sure that you're safeguarding your most important information. Not
leaving your PDFs of your 20 years of tax data on a USB drive sitting on your desk.
No. When I was doing this story on paper ID theft, one of the experts involved had said, people, if you had like $1,000 bill, you wouldn't leave that on your kitchen counter when you had people in the house. But, we will happily leave out bills and tax returns and all sorts of other things in places where like we really shouldn't. And we're just very relaxed about having that information out, and we need to be more cautious with it.
Yeah, in IT, there's this concept called the Evil Maid. Of you don't want to let the custodial staff be able to access computers and things like that. I think the same sort of thing applies to our homes. Not necessarily that we're casting dispersions on maids, but anyone who could come into the house and quickly grab a sheet of paper, grab that bill sitting on the kitchen counter, or take a photo of it is always going to be a risk.
Mm-hmm. It does seem like here, at least with the kids, I mean, it's often, though, even people who are even more close and trusted. So, while it is smart to understand anybody that's coming into your home even briefly and like be thinking about what they might have access to, it's really the friends and family members that you want to watch out for here. Something that I thought was really interesting, too, that ties in with this is the experts say they see higher rates of familiar fraud when the economy is bad, because in a lot of cases, maybe that initial compromising of the child's ID it's not always meant in a really malicious way. It can be, parents are struggling to keep the lights on or to buy groceries, and their credit is bad. They can't get that loan they need or that the funds to be able to keep the household running. So that is something that the experts have talked a lot about, is that they'll see these cases where that's how it starts, is the child's ID is compromised to keep the lights on, to buy groceries. But then unfortunately it may spiral, or, even if just the family continues to struggle, then it's not just, the parents that are hurt by this. It ends up being that the child is as well, because they have defaults or late payments or other things on their report.
Mm-hmm. So in some sense, it sounds like, at least when it comes to parents and even some familial, there isn't a whole lot that can be done to prevent it.
Unfortunately not. If there's somebody who's close to you, or it's the parent who's doing it, that's, we're the people who are applying for that social security number for the child when we're leaving the hospital. So it's unfortunate, but that is the case. But then, if it's other relatives, or even as a parent, you're just trying to think about who else might know this and have access. We've had people for my kids asking like, oh, can we get like this information because we want to set up like a 529 plan, or we want to put them as the beneficiary on the life insurance. And that's really where you have to be able to say, like, do you really need this information? And in most cases, they don't, to be able to achieve those very kind goals. So you really just want to keep that under wraps, whether the intent seems good or bad.
Yeah. And I guess that's the hard thing is in the same way that your doctor's office asks for the Social Security number, I filled out those life insurance policies and there's a spot for the Social Security number there. And if you ask, do you need it? They'll tell you, no, we don't need it, but it helps. It could potentially help in the future, but they don't voluntarily say this is optional or you don't really need this. It's just, if you've got a will and everybody knows the person who passes away, that it's very easy to find the beneficiaries.
They can safely say it's this Chris Parker, it's this Kelli Grant. But it gets complicated, obviously, if you were one of like 3 Chris Parkers in your family and somehow nobody gave you like middle initials or, numbers afterward to help designate. Then maybe you need that. But for the most part, no, it's about being able to track you down and identify you. And as you said, that's often clear through other documents and family records.
Yeah, they're not going to be looking for some random Chris Parker when someone passes away to give me money.
We can only hope. I feel like that could be a whole other podcast episode.
That would be a fun episode. People who have gotten money from random people. Although that sounds like an email scam.
I was going to say, yeah, I've got a lot of those in my inbox right now.
They're probably not legitimate.
Darn.
So, what are other ways that we can do for parents who are not trying to steal their children's identity? What kind of preventative things can they do to mitigate the risk?
Well, it's going to be important to include your child in a lot of these conversations too, because, there's just a point where kids are on the internet younger and younger, and, you want to be able to supervise them where you can and talk to them about what you've learned about how to keep information safe and how to spot a scam, because in the end, they might be filling out sweepstakes forms or contest entries or, communicating with people online that would be asking them these sorts of questions, trying to fish for information. And they should have an understanding of what it's smart to give out and what you really want to keep hidden and, why people asking about certain types of information could be a huge red flag.
Yeah, I was trying to think of at what age was I aware that I had a Social Security number? And it was probably well before I understood the ramifications of what giving it out would be.
I mean, I can remember as a kid, my mom, when I had a wallet, when I first had a wallet, that I had a photocopy of that in my wallet. And now as an adult, I just cringe and I think like, no, like, don't do that.
I think I carried the original with me.
Oh no, even worse. And that if that's not clear, that is certainly something I think people should avoid. You really don't want that in your wallet. There was a point too where people would put it on checks, their Social Security numbers. So like certainly for your kid, there will be a point where they need to know that they have a Social Security number. They will need to know what it is. Probably that's more like when they are teenagers, maybe applying for a first job. Seems like that would be the first point that's really relevant. Eventually, like when you're applying for financial aid, that's when a lot of these cases come to light. Applying for a first credit card, they might need it. But, by and large, you can have some good conversations with them about what it is and how important it is before they probably need to start knowing that number.
Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to think of what other things that we should be preventative. I guess, really considering the freezing the credit and the ramifications of that, the hassles of it. But it sounds like more important that the monitoring is probably a better option for most people.
Well, why not both? Really. Freezing the credit, monitoring the credit, really just trying to keep key documents out of sight, watching for red flags that would indicate identity theft for you or your children, or just even like a data breach for you or your children. There was a recent survey out. I'm forgetting from where, but one of my reporters is working on it this week, just that a lot of people, when there is a data breach, they just don't take smart actions afterward, like changing their password or checking to see what information was compromised. So, It's always good to pay attention if you get those notifications, like what was compromised, what you need to do, and kind of be aware afterward, because a lot of data breaches, the secondary consequence of it is that you might get like spear phishing calls where like they have some of the information and they're trying to leverage it. So, kind of just being aware of things that could indicate there is someone actively trying to use your information or leveraging it into something bigger.
Yeah, and I know kind of identity theft is this constantly evolving disaster, so to speak. There was someone I knew that it was probably more than 20 years ago now, probably 30 years ago, was a victim of identity theft. And they found out because they got a letter in the mail basically saying that there's a default judgment against them for failure to appear in court over unpaid taxes in another state. And they were like, I don't pay I don't pay taxes in this state. And so they started to look into it and pulling their credit and all this stuff, and found out that there were people in half a dozen different states using this person's social security number and name for employment. And of course, none of them were paying their taxes. And so it became this real disaster to unwind, because identity theft was such a new thing to the legal system. It was, well, yes, you very clearly have been a victim of identity theft, but to get it off of your record, you need to pay the taxes. And then you can petition to get the money back because the crime had happened. But because you never showed up to court, this has already gone to court and you've already lost. So you now have to jump through all these hoops to unwind it. And so I think it's definitely better now, but once it gets that far, it's still very messy to clean up identity theft.
Yeah, and that's, I think, where those credit freezes and that monitoring can really help. It's also worth paying attention to protections that you might have in play. There are specialized insurance policies. Certain homeowners policies include an identity theft rider or provision in there. Some credit cards have extra perks or protections in there as well. And obviously, if you have a credit monitoring service, usually they will offer some help. Even some employers, there's often some sort of an employee benefit that helps with unraveling identity theft and fraud. So really, like, if you are affected by it, it's smart to check and see what resources you might have available to you that are either going to help you unravel it or at least help mitigate the costs and time of unraveling it.
And usually, are these things that you have to have in place before you find the identity theft?
Well, it depends, because it's tied. There are, services and nonprofits too, like the Identity Theft Resource Center, that will try to help you as best they can once you've been victimized. But in a lot of cases, like with the insurance, it's, you're not going to be able to go out and like switch your homeowner's policy and then be like, and I'd like to take advantage of this provision. You would need that coverage in place. But it's always good to check and see what you might already have before you go out and look for something that would fill that need.
And I guess there also is going to be a difference between credit monitoring and identity theft insurance. The credit monitoring may or may not help you clean up issues.
Yes, you always want to look at the terms and see, like, what do they cover and to what extent? Because, as we laid out, like, there's a lot of different ways that this can go down. So, they might be more helpful with certain problems than with others. For sure, your credit card is going to be more concerned with, things that affect that credit card potentially than other types of identity theft. But, you might be surprised at what they will help you with.
And the good thing is credit monitoring and identity theft insurance is almost ubiquitous now. Whoever is selling you your auto insurance probably also sells identity theft insurance. Maybe not, but it used to be very, very few places would sell the insurance. Now it's pretty much everywhere that you look.
Unfortunately, it's like when they see a need, that's when they step in. And this is something where, as we've pointed out, there is a need.
Mm-hmm. So, are there any other things that we have missed talking about with respect to children's identity theft?
I was looking through my notes. I really just can't emphasize enough that, one of the best things you can do is avoid putting these numbers out in circulation. We're asked for them far more often than we need to give them. And that's one of the best things you can do.
Let's just always ask why they need it. Do you really need this? Will you not do business with me if I don't give you this number?
I think honestly, like sometimes you don't even ask unless they push back. Just like let it, like see if they're going to let it slide, because I really have found that most of the time, like they are not going to come back and ask you for that.
I think that's probably the best advice. Don't be confrontational about it. Just don't put it on the form.
Just don't put it on there. Like wait for them to ask and to force the issue if you can. But even then, I think you have the right to ask, well, what are you going to do with this information? How are you going to protect it? And, why? All the whys.
Not questions that the frontline people at the billing desk want to answer, but things they should
Sure.
be able to answer.
Well, and maybe that means they're not gonna really push you on it too.
That's hopefully the case. So if people want to find you on social media, where can they track you down?
I'm on Twitter at Kelli Grant. That's KELLIGRANT. And my website is kelligrant.tv. And of course, you can check out my reporting and my reporters on CNBC.com and grow.acorns.com.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the Easy Pray podcast today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Easy Pray podcast. If you found something in this episode actionable, leave a comment by visiting easypray.com/review. Notes and a transcript of this episode with Kelli Grant can be found at easypray.com/105.